few months ago, this would have been inconceivable. Such is the pace of racing car development. In June 1962, I went down to Dorking to Rob Walker's Pitbrook garage, where I'd arranged to hitch a lift to Spa for the Belgian Grand Prix. Sterling's accident had been in April, and he had remained in a coma for a month. He was now conscious, but remained paralyzed down his left-hand side. Maurice Trintignant, Rob's faithful second driver, had taken Sterling's place, driving in Rob's dark blue of Scotland. The so-called English season of non-championship races at Snetterton, Goodwood, Aintree and Silverstone had resulted in 2 BRM victories and 2 Lotus victories. The first Grand Prix at Zandvoort was won by Graham Hill's BRM, and the Monaco race to McLaren's Cooper. At Zandvoort, the Lotus team had unveiled the revolutionary Lotus 25 with its monocoque chassis. This move infuriated Rob, who had been promised by Colin Chapman the same machinery as the works for the whole 1962 season. After just 2 races, Rob's 24 was obsolete. Reminded of his promise, Chapman replied that, to all intents and purposes, Rob's 24 and the new Works 25 were the same model. John Cooper peered into the cockpit of the 25 and said, "So they are, Colin, but we've forgotten to put the chassis in this one." Al Francis relaxed while he could, for at the circuit he was sure to be busy. The first practice was held on Friday evening. The conditions were perfect for quick times, dry and not too hot. Rob Walker was there to supervise his entry. His car, number 18, the Lotus 24, had been all but destroyed in a first-lap incident at Monaco, and had a new space-frame chassis and new suspension fitted. Bowmaker had a single car, the Lola Climax V8. Reg Parnell planned his strategy for driver John Surtees. The team is very much built around John Surtees and is determined to have a good year. Ferrari had entered 4 of their 120-degree V6 cars almost unchanged from 1961. Trouble at Maranello and the loss of many of Enzo's key staff having prevented new development. The car which was so utterly dominant in 1961 was now struggling against the Climax and BRM V8 engine cars. The Ferraris were to be driven by world champion Phil Hill, Belgian Willy Meiress, Giancarlo Baghetti, and the 20-year-old Ricardo Rodriguez, making only his 3rd Grand Prix start. Maurice Trintignant was talking to Bianchi, and Al Francis to Jim Endruit, the Lotus chief mechanic. The single-plane crankshaft of the Climax V8 engine necessitated mating exhausts from each bank of cylinders. Betty Walker, as usual, helped Rob with the lap scoring and timekeeping, and records are kept of all practices. Maurice Trintignant is now a Legionnaire d'honneur for his services to French motorsport, and is in his 13th season of Grand Prix racing, the oldest driver in town. He was followed out by little Willy Meiress on a high after winning the Targa Florio and 2 non-championship Formula One races for Ferrari. A racing mechanic's life is one of intense activity interrupted by periods of waiting for his car to return. Trintignant complained to Alf about some aspects of his car's handling. Maurice, 45 this year, is well past his prime, but he did give Rob his first Grand Prix victory back in 1958, and his ability to get a car safely back to the finish in one piece is legendary. He's only had one bad accident, and that was 16 years ago. Yes, Maurice and the Walker team are made for each other. It was decided to make some small adjustments to the steering geometry. The Belgian police are always perfect gentlemen compared to the police at Monza. Graham Hill was chatting to friends. He'd already set a time of 4 minutes 3 seconds, but knew that he would need to go much faster. Famed motor racing correspondent Bernard Caillet offered his opinion to an interested observer. Meanwhile, Maurice Trintignant was being interviewed by the French television service, recording his Gallic charm. For reasons best known to themselves, Alf Francis and Maurice, being Polish and French respectively, always conversed in Italian. With the adjustment made, Maurice prepared to venture out onto the circuit once again. I think racing cars should have at least 6 and preferably 8 cylinders if they are to sound like racing cars. The Yankee was getting some advice from Alf. He was down to drive Rob's old 4-cylinder Lotus 18. Trintignant came in again, this time with ignition trouble. As Alf talked to Colin Chapman, the Lucas representative got to work on his transistorized ignition system. Maurice also sparked himself up, a Gauloise, I think. No one went particularly well in this evening's practice. Last year, Phil Hill had gone round in 3 minutes 59.3 seconds. Only 2 cars had managed to get below 4 minutes, which is an average of 131 miles an hour. One of them was the Lotus, driven by Trevor Taylor. Jim Clark's Coventry Climax V8 had damaged itself when a dowel in the camshaft driving mechanism had shared. The second car to go under 4 minutes was the Ferrari of Phil Hill, who was describing his quick lap to the Rodriguez brothers. Phil, the reigning world champion, was born in Miami some 35 years ago and is in his 5th Grand Prix season. He's always been associated with Ferrari cars, having commenced his career in the 1952 Carrera Panamericana. The next morning, we paid a short visit to the garage near the circuit, where the Rob Walker cars were always stable. There, the UDT driver, Maston Gregory, the likeable American, had called in and was entertaining Alf Francis. Maston's Lotus was BRM engined, unlike Rob's Climax engined cars. We watched Saturday practice from Master Village, as the cars come through the tricky long S bend before going down towards Stavelot. Trevor Taylor was taking this corner at around 125 miles an hour. Next through was Ricardo Rodriguez. Then Richie Ginther in the Owen Racing Organisation Works BRM. Willie Meres's Ferrari had also beaten the 4-minute mark. The wonderful 14.1-kilometre circuit runs deep in the Ardennes forest, between the villages of Francorchamps, Malmedy and Stavelot. After the start, the cars go downhill, left-right uphill through Eau Rouge, one of the best-known corners in the world. After this rise, the road starts to drop down towards Bernaville. Then comes the very fast open section at Malmedy. After Malmedy comes the long, famous Master Straight, where there is very little protection on either side of the road for any unforced errors by the drivers. Next is the tricky long S-bend near the railway station, and then on, dropping now towards Stavelot. We note that this is a road circuit, complete with houses, walls, telegraph poles, and all sorts of other objects at the side of the road. The 120-mile-an-hour Stavelot curve takes us back onto the return leg of the circuit. The drivers are climbing now very slightly, with flat-out bends and a nasty drop into the fields below, on the right of the road. On up towards Blanchimont, past the clubhouse, and so to La Source hairpin, the only slow corner on the whole circuit, before returning to the pits. Race day brought the usual bustle of activity in the paddock, and we note the Rob Walker transporter still bears Sterling Moss's name, despite Sterling's serious injuries. BRM had abandoned the separate stack pipes, which were prone to breaking off, in favour of conventional tailpipes. Jack Brabham was now running his own team and using a Lotus Climax as a stopgap until his own car was ready. He'd qualified 15th. There was little activity on the circuit, as the meeting had no supporting races. Instead, the organisers planned to start the Grand Prix in good time, at 2:30 p.m. Reg Parnell and Alf Francis were deep in discussion about their respective cars, Alf displaying his pride at his latest modifications. Further along the pit lane, the dark green BRM team cars were gleaming immaculately. The heart of the BRM team with Raymond Mays, Graham Hill and Tony Rudd. The second BRM was due to be driven by Richie Ginther. His car had a Colotti gearbox, whereas Hill's car had the new BRM version. In the Walker pit, Maurice had his admirers. Alf and his team had done all they could in preparation. Trantignon's car, number 18, was now ready. Betty and daughter d'Auvergne Walker prepared to cope with the lap charts and timekeeping. Before the start, the drivers were paraded on the back of a variety of open-topped motorcars and driven at a snail's pace around the circuit. World champion Phil Hill led the parade away, followed by Jack Brabham and Maurice Trintignant. Of course, at Aintree, such a parade takes little time. But at Spa, with a lap distance of over 8 miles, this is something of a lengthy version, and I suspect a tiresome task for the drivers. Bringing up the rear of the parade was Louis Chiron, now 63, and one of the few men around who has driven in Grand Prix both before and after the war. Chiron has been running the Monaco Grand Prix and the Monte Carlo Rally for the past 6 years. All the cars got away cleanly. Through Eau Rouge, the order was as in practice: Graham Hill, McLaren, Taylor, Mayress, Gregory and Ireland. Into La Source, Hill held a slim lead over Taylor. McLaren was third, and Jim Clark a fantastic fourth, up from 12th on the grid. The Ferrari of Mayress was in 5th place. By lap 2, Trevor Taylor's Lotus led, followed by McLaren, Mayress, Graham Hill and Clark. Baghetti had already stopped with ignition trouble. Rob checked the times, but Trintignant was simply not quick enough and was lying well back. Trevor Taylor still led for Team Lotus, with McLaren, Mayress, Clark and Hill all nose to tail behind. Teammates Rodriguez and Phil Hill were 6th and 7th, with Innes Ireland 8th. The 5 leading cars were having a tremendous battle and were continually passing and repassing one another. Trintignant was 13th, but his engine was not at its best. On the 4th lap, there was a tremendous cheer from the crowd as Belgian Mayress appeared in the lead, the other 4 cars still snapping at his heels. Through Eau Rouge, it was Mayress, Taylor, McLaren, Hill and Clark. These 5 were now well ahead of the chasing Ferrari duo. After waiting and watching, Clark had moved from 5th to 1st in little over a single lap. Ireland didn't like the handling of his Lotus and came in, whereupon his UDT mechanics found the rear wishbone mountings were on the point of collapse. Trintignant was given his time, 5 seconds behind de Beaufort. He really was struggling. Clark now started to pull away from the 4 cars behind him. Graham Hill's BRM was another with ignition trouble, and he was struggling to stay with the leading group. Phil Hill and Rodriguez were still in close company, often overtaking one another, sometimes unnecessarily. Innes Ireland had gone over to tell Colin Chapman about his broken Lotus. The UDT team had brought in Maston Gregory as a precaution. Clark now led by about 10 seconds from Taylor, who could not shake off Meres. The Hill and Rodriguez Ferraris were about to lap Trintignant. Meres passed Taylor. These two were having a tough battle for second place. Bruce McLaren walked home after losing his oil pressure. Taylor and Meres continued to change places, still lapping at over 131 miles an hour. Rob was in the unusual position of not being in the picture at all. The absence of Sterling certainly showed in the team's performance. Jim Clark was now lapping in 3 minutes 56 seconds, pulling away at over 2 seconds per lap. Trevor Taylor and Meres seemed to get close to each other. Taylor's inexperience pitched against Meres's exuberance. And then on lap 26, the inevitable happened. The cars touched at over 100 miles an hour. The Lotus knocked down a telegraph pole and crashed into a ditch. The Ferrari caught fire and landed upside down. Luckily, both drivers were flung out of their cars, and so were okay. The other cars were forced to pass by the scene of the accident very cautiously. The race continued, with the 2 remaining Ferraris now in 3rd and 4th place. The second works Cooper of South African Tony Maggs retired with gearbox troubles. Clark now held a very secure lead over Graham Hill's still spluttering BRM. Surtees slowed past the Lotus pit to tell them that he had seen Taylor and that Trevor was uninjured. Taylor, in his obvious yellow overalls, was paraded in front of Clark to show Jimmy that he was indeed unhurt. Clark was now able to tour home, having driven a well-judged and intelligent race. sheep farmer from the Scottish borders thus took his first victory. Graham Hill was second, and Phil Hill just pipped teammate Rodriguez for third on the line. Graham thus moved into an outright lead in the World Championship standing with 16 points to Phil's 14. Trintignant ended up 8th. Lucien Bianchi reported in to Rob's engineers on his 9th place in their second car, 3 laps behind Clark. Clark also won that year at Aintree and Watkins Glen, but Graham Hill's victories at Monaco, Nürburgring, Monza and East London in South Africa made him the 1962 world champion.